The sense of hearing is accomplished by a process known as auditory transduction. The ear converts sound waves in the air into electrical impulses, which can be interpreted by the brain. As sound enters the ear, it passes through the external auditory canal, where it meets the tympanic membrane. The tympanic membrane then vibrates in response to the sound. Sounds of a lower pitch, or frequency, produce a slower rate of vibration, and sounds of lower volume, or amplitude, produce a less dramatic vibration. Higher frequency sounds produce faster vibrations. The tympanic membrane is cone-shaped and articulates with a chain of 3 bones called the auditory ossicles. They consist of the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. The movements of the tympanic membrane vibrate the ossicles, passing on the information of frequency and amplitude. The 3 bones pivot together on an axis shown here in red. The pivotal axis is due to a series of ligaments which hold the bones in place within the middle ear cavity. The anterior malleal ligament and the posterior incutal ligament are of particular importance for the pivotal axis. 2 structures which normally obscure this view of the middle ear have been removed. They are the chordae tympani nerve and the tendon of the tensor tympani muscle. Through the ossicles, the vibrations of the tympanic membrane are transferred to the footplate of the stapes. The stapes moves with a piston-like action, which sends vibrations into a structure called the bony labyrinth. The labyrinth is filled with a fluid called perilymph. If it were a completely closed and inflexible system, the movement of the stapes would be unable to displace the perilymph, and therefore unable to send vibrations into the bony structure. Due to the flexibility of a membrane called the round window, the stapes movement can displace the perilymph, allowing vibrations to enter the labyrinth. The corridor leading to the round window is found within the spiral portion of the bony labyrinth known as the cochlea. Vibrations produced by the stapes are drawn into the spiral system and return to meet the round window. The portion of the spiral passage in which vibrations ascend to the apex of the cochlea is called the scala vestibuli. The descending portion of the passage is called the scala tympani. A third structure, called the cochlear duct, is situated between the scala vestibuli and the scala tympani. The cochlear duct is filled with a fluid called endolymph, and when viewed in cross-section, the membranes separating the 2 fluid-filled systems are visible. They are Reissner's membrane and the basilar membrane. The membranes are flexible and move in response to the vibrations traveling up the scala vestibuli. The movements of the membranes then send vibrations back down to the scala tympani. A specialized structure called the organ of Corti is situated on the basilar membrane. As the basilar membrane vibrates, the organ of Corti is stimulated, which sends nerve impulses to the brain via the cochlear nerve. The actual nerve impulses are generated by specialized cells within the organ of Corti called hair cells. The hair cells are closely covered by a structure called the tectorial membrane. As the basilar membrane vibrates, the tiny clusters of hairs are bent against the tectorial membrane, triggering the hair cells to fire. The entire basilar membrane does not vibrate simultaneously. Instead, specific areas along the basilar membrane move variably in response to different frequencies of sound. Lower frequencies vibrate the basilar membrane closer to the apex of the cochlea, whereas higher frequencies produce vibrations closer to the base. This arrangement is known as tonotopic organization. Together, this sequence of events is responsible for our acoustic perception of the world around us.
So that's your quick overview. You saw us go from the outside, this pinna thing here, all the way into the cochlea. Now we're going to kind of review these different parts. And in the next 15 minutes, you're going to have a whole kind of overview of just how we get to the point where we're actually sending some information to the brain. This is just a general kind of really nice graphic that divides outer, middle, and inner. And the point is that each section has very specific jobs, very specific functions. Even this section, the outer ear, which is this thing called the pinna in the ear canal, there's a lot of really important processing going on that enable us to hear the way we do. And everything in the outer ear is basically air vibration. It's acoustic energy. By the time we transfer that into the middle ear, where those three bones are, it's mechanical energy, which then delivers the energy again into the cochlea, which is basically hydraulic energy. It's shifting fluid back and forth. The outer ear has two really important functions, critical functions. One is your ability to localize. The fact that you can hear in three-dimensional space is due to signal processing, really EQ and really comb filters that are being generated by these pinna and the spacing and the position of your ears, even your shoulders. It's something we call HRTFs, or head-related transfer functions. That's all we're going to talk about localization, but the point is the outer ear is really critical to give you those localization cues. What we are going to look at, however, is this thing, this well, the concha, you know, where you hang your earbuds, and the ear canal itself, if you study a little acoustics, it's a resonating tube. It's closed at one end. The combined EQ curve of the outer ear is this. Between 15 and 20 dB boost from 2K to 6K. Built in. Why would we have that? Pardon? Speech frequencies. In particular, the phonemes and the consonant frequencies. Right? Because that's where all the critical differences are. The difference in phonemes, A, E, I, O, U, those are all upper frequency partials in your voice, as well as all the consonant frequencies that enable us to hear the difference between a P, a B, a T, and a D. Right? Pretty subtle, and if we didn't have that extra amplification, we wouldn't be able to hear it as well as we do. The fact of the matter is all mammals in their outer ears are tuned to their communication frequencies. So it's a part of the evolution of each species, and the fact that we are ultimately acoustic communicating animals. I mean, when you think about it, you don't even get that much EQ in a console, at least in an analog console. The middle ear then is taking that acoustic energy with the tympanic membrane, it's just like a microphone diaphragm, delivering it to that mechanical set of bones that then goes to the stapes footplate, which is like a piston. You're going from air to fluid. There's a huge impedance mismatch, something we deal with anytime we plug a bass direct into a console. What do you use when you do that? A DI box. What's it doing? It's matching the impedance of the pickup to the microphone input. And if you didn't have it, well, try plugging a bass direct into a mic input and see what you get. You won't get anything. Nor would you get anything in your ears if you didn't have this middle ear system. Another interesting thing, something called the acoustic reflex. There are actually a pair of muscles in there that react to loud sound and pull back like a brake on the ossicles so to protect you from loud sound. Of course, it evolved 1.5 million years ago when there really wasn't much above 2K, and that's about where the effectiveness of the acoustic reflex stops. But it's there, and they're working right now whenever you hear loud sound. These are the smallest bones in your body, in case you're wondering how small they are. And this is a wonderful little animation that gives you literally a real idea of exactly how this lever system works, with the tympanic membrane driving that lever system of the auditory ossicles to the stapes footplate, and the stapes footplate is then pumping the fluid inside the cochlea back and forth. So we've brought ourselves up to this point here. Here's the cochlea. It's kind of funny. You'd think that the cochlea, based on some of these images that you see, that you could crack the skull open and pick it out, and you can't do that. The cochlea develops inside the bones of your skull, and a part of your skull is called the temporal bone. It forms inside there. So it's not really something that's like an organ that you could pull out. But inside the cochlea, then, is where this fluid shifting is going on. And what we want to do now is sort of show you something described in the animation called the basilar membrane, which actually does frequency analysis for us. And commonly what we do is we unwind the cochlea. Well, what do you mean unwind the cochlea? Well, the cochlea is a 3.5 centimeter long organ that wouldn't fit in your head if it weren't wound up into a coil. So we're just going to unwind it and see how the basilar membrane works.
So here we are with a view of the cochlea. The cochlea now uncoils, and we look at the basilar membrane, and now see what happens when we play individual tones. Now a chord, and finally something really complex. So I kid you not. I mean, this is really what's going on in your ear all the time. It's rather amazing, isn't it? This, for those of you with a mathematical bent, is rather like what's called spectral analysis or Fourier analysis. You break down a waveform into its different sinusoidal components, because each and every waveform that's out there, every sound you can hear, can be described as the sum of a series of sine and cosine waves. And that's exactly what this apparatus does.
So what's happening as you listen, whenever you're listening, whenever the ears are operating, which, by the way, as we know, is all the time, this basilar membrane is vibrating at different points along its length depending upon the frequency components of the sound that you're hearing. So it's a little bit like it's spectral analysis. It's a real-time analyzer. We have plugins in Pro Tools that show us the spectral balance of the sound that we're listening to. And that's basically what the basilar membrane is doing it organically. Sitting on top of the basilar membrane, then, is the organ of Corti, which is where the hair cells live. And the hair cells are the sensory cells, kind of like the rods and cones in your eye. They're going to, when they are activated by the basilar membrane, they then send information to the brain. So what they're doing is basically saying how much amplitude there is at this band of frequencies versus this band of frequencies versus this band of frequencies, because I think we all know that everything has its unique frequency fingerprint, right? And what's amazing is that this works at all, as far as I'm concerned. If we go in a little bit further, we pull back, pull back the tectorial membrane. That's what we're seeing here. So here you can see those stereocilia, which are sort of the activating switches of the hair cells. 3 rows of outer hair cells, 1 row of inner hair cells. And this is what the stereocilia actually look like. They're called hair cells, but these certainly look like hairs. They're more like baseball bats. But these are the key to the operation of the hair cells. Again, here we can see 3 rows of outer, 1 row of inner hair cells, and the basilar membrane below. So as the basilar membrane vibrates, it stimulates those cells. Every hair cell, inner versus outer, works in the same way. When we bend those stereocilia, it literally allows current to flow in the form of potassium ions. You heard of fluid called endolymph and perilymph. They're kind of like a battery. And so when those stereocilia are activated, the cell goes into action, and it produces a voltage shift in the cells. The inner hair cells are the listening cells. They're the ones that are actually talking to the brain, and they release what's called neurotransmitter when the stereocilia are activated. So we listen with basically 3,500 inner hair cells on each side of our head, and those 3,500 hair cells are lining across the length of the basilar membrane, which is then, of course, vibrating according to what frequencies you're listening to. The outer hair cells, and this was just recently discovered in the late 90s, early 2000s, they're actually amplifier cells. What they do is give you the ability to hear quiet stuff. Basically, stuff below a whisper you would not be able to hear without outer hair cells. Because when the outer hair cells are stimulated, they flex like little muscles. There's a protein called Preston that was discovered at Northwestern University. It was a huge discovery because it explained why we have a dynamic range of 120 dB from the threshold of hearing to the threshold of pain because of outer hair cells. This is kind of a detailed description of what they're actually doing and try to capsulize what's happening. What the red line is showing you is if the hair cells were always operating at full tilt gain, which is roughly about 60 dB. That's like a mic pre. That's a lot of gain. But we don't get a 60 dB of gain because if they were always on full, what would be a 60 dB, or basically a quiet voice, would be the threshold of pain. So in fact, those outer hair cells are regulated by the brain, which is what this line shows. What this line is showing is that we have full 60 dB of gain up to about 20 dB, and as the sound gets louder, the brain basically dials back the outer hair cells till you get to about 90-95 dB, and then the hair cells shut off because we don't need them anymore, right? So they're this variable gain amplifier that increases as you get quieter, which we in audio would call an upward compressor, right? So you have this constantly operating upward compressor function in your head all the time. So you've just learned how the ear works. The outer ear provides us with localization cues and EQs so that we can hear human speech better. The middle ear provides a mechanical protection system plus impedance matching so we have energy going from air to fluid effectively. You basically would have about a 30 dB loss without it. The basilar membrane is the frequency analyzer, and the hair cells resting on top of the basilar membrane tell us how much energy at each frequency band, and the outer hair cells give us basically our bottom 60 dB of dynamic range. Right? So that's how it works. Done. You've just figured it out. All right. So what the question now becomes is, how does it break? What does that mean? How does it manifest itself? Noise-induced hearing loss primarily. Now, severe hearing loss can occur in the blink of an eye. You empty an M16 in a cinder block room, that will take your hearing out just like that. I mean, and you hear weird stories of the organ of Corti is ripped off the basilar membrane. I mean, that's how severe the trauma can be. But mild trauma, the stuff that we endure basically all of our lives, basically causes damage to the stereocilia. If the stereocilia is strained to the point that they break, we've lost the switch that activates the hair cell, and then obviously the hair cell isn't going to function. So that's what happens, and what we ultimately do is we begin to lose our sensitivity to various bands of frequencies as we age. So the first question is, well, how do we measure all this stuff? What is the modes of measuring sound and measuring loss? Well, the first thing I just want to introduce you to is just the friendliest little SPL meter you've ever met. It's made by a company called Tenma, $30. I should post this, or I'll give it to John, and he can let you know. $30. If you get together and order together, it's free shipping. So this beats the hell out of the Radio Shack one. It's self-leveling. It's constantly operating. If it's in the dark, it lights up. It's easy to hold. It's very friendly. Okay. You should know how loud stuff is. In my class, the class that I teach called Studies in Hearing at Columbia College, I actually send the kids out with SPL meters just to measure your day. Why would I do that? Because then the stuff that you experience every day, oh, when I listen to my stereo, that's 87. Okay, now I know what 87 means. In Chicago, if you're walking down Wabash and the L rows overhead, that's 95 to 98. Oh, okay, I know what that means because I experience it all the time. One of the most important things I think we need to do is to begin to calibrate ourselves to what's safe and what's not safe. And if you're in a band, you start measuring your rehearsal space, I think you'll start to realize you should really be doing something about your rehearsal space, or how you rehearse, or the possibility of protecting yourself. These are a couple of what we call dosimeters. These are SPL meters that you wear, and they log sound pressure level over time. And later on, you're going to see some readouts, some measurements of things like sporting events and such, which are dosimetric readings, where somebody went into an environment wearing a dosimeter, and you can see the changing volume of the environment. In the world of hearing conservation and hearing awareness, these are critical to our studies, because this is how we can actually establish whether an environment is dangerous or not. Who's here has had a hearing test? Oh, good. Hopefully you still have that chart, because the fact that you've had one means you should absolutely go back and have another one. What's most important, it's not like just getting your teeth cleaned and, okay, my teeth are clean. You get one test and that becomes a baseline, and then 2 years later you go back for another test and see if whatever it is that you're doing is actually causing some loss, where you compare those two audiograms. An audiogram is basically a frequency response chart of your hearing. Now, you may notice it only goes from 125 to 8,000. Where's the rest of it? The problem is that the audiology community is only interested in speech communication, and they're just now beginning to become aware of 20 to 20K, hello. Not that we can accurately test your ability your sensitivity to 20, the really low and the really high frequencies, but they're just beginning to become aware that the range of hearing is not 125 to 8K. But anyway, that's what they test you, because they're using pure tones. Okay. So we know how to measure. We understand that. We're going to look at some charts to know what's safe and what's dangerous. And we understand how the measuring of hearing system works. When you are traumatized, stereocilia are damaged, they become broken, they fuse, all kinds of crazy things can happen. And if they do, then the function of the hair cell is degraded or shut down altogether. What's interesting to note is that the outer hair cell stereocilia are actually embedded in that, it's actually jello-like tectorial membrane. They're embedded in that tectorial membrane. Important because that's how they are able to drive that mechanical energy that they drive into the cochlea. Of course, the problem is they're the first to go, which I guess is kind of good, because the inner hair cells, the actual listening cells, will go later. That's not to say that they're completely immune to trauma, but they're less inclined to be damaged, and more inclined will be happening, you'll be more often happening in the outer hair cells. So what you lose is that gain function, right? That upward compressor function is what becomes compromised initially in noise-induced hearing loss. So the second issue is, it's not broadband. If you lose your hearing, it's not something like somebody has turned the volume down. Because remember that since the basilar membrane is reacting to different frequencies along its length, where you suffer the trauma the most in a particular frequency band, that's where the hair cell damage will occur. So you will lose sensitivity in the frequencies you're getting hit the hardest. Here we have a couple of audiograms. These are my students. All my students go out to get their hearing tested while they take my class. This is a couple of students from a couple of years ago. Very nice curves. Well, gee, why aren't they up at 0? Very few people are actually up at 0. 0 means you can hear all the way down to the clinical threshold of hearing. Most people are somewhere between -5 or 5 and 15 dB HL. HL stands for hearing level. So these are perfectly good curves. Here we have examples of professional audio and music people suffering from what we call a noise notch. What's interesting is the nature of the loss. It's not the same in each ear. Well, in the case on the left, we've got a DJ. X is left, O is right. The DJ would cover his right ear with the headphone to cue up the next record, and the left ear was exposed to the room. So the left ear suffers more damage. We have a drummer on the right. Same thing, more loss in the left than the right. Drummers, any idea why? Bingo, exactly right. It's always behind the hi-hat because the floor toms are where you get in and get out. I've set up so many drum kits, and the monitor's always there, whether it's a wedge or a side fill. So this poor drummer's left ear has been getting pummeled, and you can see increased loss. Now, we see loss in both ears. Why the notch between 2 and 6K? Well, that's the reason, right? The noise notch, that dip between 2 and 6K, is a clear indication of noise-induced hearing loss. Now, I'm saying noise-induced hearing loss because there are other forms of hearing loss. Drug-related, ototoxins, hereditary, which will cause different kinds of loss. But when an audiologist sees that, they go, oh, you got a noise notch. Oh, thanks, doc. So that's the point. Another thing to think about is something that we've all experienced. It's called temporary threshold shift. You have a night out, you come home, your ears are ringing a little bit, it feels like you have cotton in your ears, and after a couple of days it comes back, right? Well, this is called TTS, or temporary threshold shift. This is an extreme example, but you can see that it can take anywhere from 2 to 4 days to fully recover from that temporary loss. This is 115 dB of noise, which is pretty loud, done at a time when there were no regulations on testing people. Well, we wouldn't be able to do this today, but what's interesting is 30 seconds after the exposure, you see a 50 dB loss right in that noise notch. I mean, there's the proof of the pudding, right? Broadband noise, really loud, and where does the loss occur? Right in that range from 2 to 6 kilohertz. Here we go. 15 minutes later, it already recovers about 20 dB, and then fully recovered after 4 days, right? Now, the only problem with this is that the most recent research done out of Harvard University is showing that temporary shift causes a latent damage in the nerve cells at the base of the hair cells. And what we're finding out now, and this is the most recent research, is that those of us who suffer hearing loss as we grow old, it's not because we grew old. It's because of the wear and tear that we suffered all of our lives. And I need to say this now. Everybody's different, right? The very famous piano player U.B. Blake smoked and drank into his 90s, right? He had a robust constitution. I have colleagues who do not suffer loss at noise levels that I might potentially suffer loss. We don't know. Everybody's physiology is different. How do you know? By seeing an audiologist. You should see an audiologist almost as often as you see your optometrist if you need glasses. Some of us need glasses, some of us don't, right? Everybody's physiology is different. Our hearing is no different from that. So it's an important thing to understand. But this TTS thing is something we're going to come back to and talk about even as a temporary issue that we deal with as live sound engineers, especially those of you who are mixing front of house. We've seen how frequency response shifts with noise loss. There's also a dynamic shift that occurs with noise loss, with noise-induced loss. Since those outer hair cells are those gain cells that are so important for hearing things that are quiet, the phenomenon that is described in audiological terms is called hearing recruitment. And here's the thing. Think back to the graph that I showed you. The outer hair cells are operating when things are quiet. As things get louder, the gain is turned down. I don't need as much. You get up to the point to about 90, 95 dB SPL, which is loud, there's no outer hair cell operation at all. So if we lose our outer hair cells, our sense of loudness doesn't change. Loud is loud. The sense of quiet is what changes. How many here have relatives with hearing loss? Okay. Then it's always speak up, speak up, speak up. Oh, you don't have to yell. Right? Yeah, funny. You don't want to be there. Because they can't hear anything, and then it's immediately too loud. That's recruitment. What you lose is the bottom end of your dynamic range. Right? So not only does your frequency response get pushed out of whack, but so does your dynamic response. And folks, we're all about frequency and amplitude and time, right? I mean, that's what our worlds are built on. Everything we do as musicians and audio engineers is based on some combination of those three elements. So, okay, at least my sense of time is I can still play with a good groove, but frequency and amplitude, how do we regulate our instruments? How do we regulate our recording consoles? How do we regulate our PA systems? If that gets pushed out of whack, you're going to be struggling to do the right job. What about the hazards? Okay, now here's where we're going to see some dosimetric readings. First, what is safe? And you've got this in your handbooks. We have two charts here. One is what's obviously showing you, basically what it all boils down to. It's not what's too loud. It's a question, a combination of loudness and duration of exposure. You can listen to a really loud sound for a short period of time, it won't damage you. You can listen to a moderately or even a less loud sound, but if the duration is long enough, it'll cause damage. So we have this interesting sliding scale. In the middle is basically by this what's called safe continuous exposure, NIOSH, the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. I can now roll that off my tongue. Which is the research leg of OSHA. It's for noise exposure. It's in Cincinnati, Ohio, where they did this incredible piece of research in the 60s in the automotive industry, where they had this huge cohort, lots of different exposures, lots of different machinery, lots of different exposure times, and they could actually build a huge, huge data set to do some analysis and test these people over time to see who was suffering hearing loss and who wasn't based on their exposure. And so based on their research, what you see in that middle column is safe exposure time effective for 97% of the sample. So for 97% of the people tested, these are safe exposure times. Now, when OSHA got their hands on this chart, they said there's no way we're going to be able to regulate this. There's no way we're going to be able to force industry to comply to these numbers. We've got to rework the data and come up with a less stringent chart. And what they did was took and found the exposure rates that would be safe for 75% of the sample. Right? So again, these are safe numbers for 75% of the population. The question is, which side of that dividing line are you? But what we in the conservation world go, come on, folks, we want to be safe for as many people as possible. We should be attempting to reach the NIOSH terms. And what I always like to talk, where I like to point my own students is, you see 100 dB, you're good for 15 minutes, then get out. Now, can we really? We'll address that in a little bit. The military. What's interesting, now I told you since these statistics about the Middle East veterans, returning Middle East veterans, oh yeah, it's all the gunfire. The gunfire is barely half of what they're exposed to. The military transports alone are noise hazards. A stock Humvee at 45 miles an hour is 95 to 98 dB SPL. Look at your chart. So just getting to the battlefield is a noise hazard. They've got generators running everywhere. And they're just noise hazards all over for the military. In 2004, some students of mine went to 5 different dance clubs in Chicago with those dosimeters and measured just how loud they were. I, of course, picked the loudest one. What you're looking at, the yellow curve is the most important because that's what we call the time-weighted average of the exposure. What you're looking at is a time-weighted average between 95 and 100 dB. So you're basically looking at 15 to 30 minutes safe exposure time in a dance club. Who spends 30 minutes in a dance club? This is my favorite. Hockey games. 20,000 fans in an enclosed arena, hard roof, ice, plexiglass. I mean, Seattle Seahawks, that's pretty incredible for an open-air stadium to reach 132. They reach, as you can see, at particular points, 120 dB SPL. Time-weighted average, 100 to 104. And it's a 3-hour game. Right? We don't even consider other forms of entertainment as potential noise hazards. This one's another good one, NASCAR. Not only is it a 3-hour race, but there are 3 races across the weekend. Right? Again, averaging 104 to 107. My friend who actually took the readings was in the seats and caught this one guy who, at the beginning of the race, he's just sitting there with his jacket on, unprotected, and then as it gets hot, he takes his jacket off and protects himself, and then later on, go figure. People don't. I mean, it's like, okay, I'm wearing my protection. Okay, I'm protected. I can take them off now. My other favorite is walking around Chicago, and I'll see a crew of city workers, and one guy's on the jackhammer, and the other 2 are watching. And the only one with protection is the guy running the jackhammer. The other guys are like 4 feet away. Well, I'm not running it. Oh, well, then you're absolutely safe. Right? People just don't think about it. My wife has we have a house on a lake in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Yeah, it's cold up there already. And we deal with jet skis all the time. And so I was really interested in, and we have snowmobiles in the winter and jet skis during the summer. And I was curious because I hear these things from quite a distance. So I'm looking, I was struggling to find information. What I loved was the jet ski information where they actually said, well, at half throttle, who runs a jet ski at half throttle? Right? I mean, come on. Anyway, point is, we're seeing about the same thing. We're looking at about 15 minutes safe exposure time for either a jet ski, that's where they really dig running around in circles on the lake, or the snowmobile, which up there is the primary mode of transportation in the winter months. So the point is, even sport recreational vehicles are potential noise hazards. Your parents all point to earbuds as the great evil of youth. And while they may or may not, you do need to know how bad they can be. And this is an extreme example. A good friend of mine, Brian Fliger, who's a chief audiologist at Boston Children's Hospital, had a fellow come in, 24 years old, Massachusetts transportation worker, working on highways with lots of heavy machinery, and decided that he would drown out the machinery noise with his iPod. And you can see what happened. He's got the hearing of a 70-year-old, right? The problem with iPods, the problem with earbuds, is not that people tend to listen too loud. In fact, Brian did a research project with another fellow, Corey Portnoff, out of the University of Denver, where they were studying, actually measuring earbuds as people were walking around in New York City or walking out of a subway. And what they basically found was, without listening in a quiet environment, in your room or a quiet environment, only about 8% of the sample actually listened at dangerous levels. But in a noisy environment, over 80% listen at dangerous levels. And the reason is earbuds don't isolate you. So what you do is you turn it up louder than the environment, right? That's when they become dangerous. You know, guns don't kill people, people kill people. iPods don't hurt hearing. Improper use of iPods ruin your hearing. So be cautious about this. Be careful. Think about where you are. I mean, in Chicago, we've got really loud subways, and I'll be sitting in the subway, and I measure 95 in there. And I'll hear somebody's earbuds from 3 rows away. Average level of an earbud listener will be 6 dB over the ambient noise, right? So you do the math. You can see what's happening to people like this. Don't listen to your earbuds at all costs. Don't listen to your iPods at all costs. Give your ears a rest. Don't think about just listening and wearing them all day long, because then you're potentially moving into that area where your exposure time is long enough that even moderate listening volumes can be dangerous. Musicians, your own instrument is a hazard. I have a colleague, Michael Santucci, is a wonderful audiologist in Chicago. Half the violinists in the CSO are his patients. Those $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 violins are really loud, and the left ear is just a few inches away from the instrument. They're measuring 100 to 110 dB at the eardrum of these concert violinists. And you can see what we're looking at here. The fact of the matter is classical musicians are suffering more hearing loss than pop musicians. Why would that be? They practice more, absolutely right. They're always practicing. It's true, right? So again, you know, everything is a potential hazard here. And just having that in your head becomes the beginnings of being able to make some informed decisions. Oh, this is just a shot. This is my friend Brian did this, just so you can see how they do this. You see this mechanism hung over this girl's ear. This is called a probe tube microphone. So it's literally a microphone at the end of a very skinny tube, and so the tube is placed right at the eardrum. Now this is a student model violin, and he's measuring over as much as 100 dB at the eardrum. So even a student model violin is a potential hazard. All too often, people don't see an audiologist until they get these secondary effects, what we call noise-induced hearing disorders. Many of us have tinnitus, which can be caused by things other than noise. Hyperacusis, which some of you may know about because you have it. It's a sensitivity to loud sound. That can be brought on by overexposure. Phil Collins is a perfect example. Phil Collins actually even used in-ear monitors, but he was playing them, he was using them too loud. He cannot perform anymore because it hurts too much. That's hyperacusis. He can't stand loud sound, and that was brought on by noise Diplacusis is a real scary one for musicians because, in fact, the other aspects of how the hearing system work is that noise-induced disorders can include pitch perception problems. And there's a guy named Marshall Chase, and you noted in an earlier slide. He runs an operation called the Musicians Clinic of Canada. He's based out of Toronto. And he's actually got some statistics of an incredible number of musicians currently practicing and performing who admit to pitch perception problems. And this is brought on by noise exposure. So what do we do? What are we going to do, man? Know how loud it is. You should get yourself an SPL meter so that you begin to understand where the hazards actually lie, right? Some form of protection. I'll go down my list. I forgot what it was like. Limit exposure. I mean, you don't have to stay there all day long, all night long. Give yourself a rest. How much rest hasn't really been clinically figured. They haven't figured that part out. 15, 20 minutes. That rest actually enables your hair cells to actually recover. It's a kind of a complex process, but basically they kind of clean themselves out. The noise exposure kind of builds up crud in your ears, in your inner ear, and you can't flush it out. And giving yourself a rest actually gives you some recovery time and an ability to go back and for more exposure. Use of plugs when appropriate, and I'll talk a little bit about this in just a minute. And the point is, if you're a musician, I'll talk about it right now. If you're a musician, plugs will change your perception of your instrument. And you have to be ready to deal with that. Sometimes you can and sometimes you can't. But at least where you can, you use them. Realize that overprotection, there's no benefit in over attenuation. Wearing a 9 dB plug, if it gets you to an acceptable exposure time, is going to be much better than a 20 dB plug because the 20 dB plug is going to shift your hearing that much more. It changes how you hear stuff. Don't try to go cold turkey. You're starting to learn, you're starting to understand, you can begin to change some of your habits. That's the most important thing. Change your habits, decide, okay, I'm not going to do this, I'm going to do this. I'll go try some plugs, those kinds of things. These are important. So incremental change is what's really important. That's what can be long lasting. You all got a pair of one or the other of these. On the left are what are called Clarities by a company called Howard Light. They're an industrial protection company. You cannot get these at CVS. I've been yelling at them to offer them, and they just don't understand because we're an industrial protection company. Okay, well, whatever. But you can order them online through Grainger, which is an industrial supply house. These are like $4 a pair. On the right are very famous, kind of known as musicians' earplugs by Etymotic Research. They're called Ety plugs. Average price around $13. And there's a page in your handbook that talks about them. If you've never used them before, I think you'll be delighted because musicians' earplugs, what we call flat attenuation earplugs, don't make everything sound muffled. Too many of us assume that earplugs are like the yellow barrels that you buy at CVS and they make everything sound like this. Why? Anybody? Why do those plugs sound like that? Because they reduce high frequencies more than low frequencies. Yeah, we just took a high frequency shelf and turned it down. That sounds good, right? So the point is, there's a lot of people who have never used flat response plugs. Okay, what am I getting? Just the last thing, just a note, it's in the handbook. For $12, you're flat to 8K. For $4, you're flat to 4K. Just so you know. But I actually find the Howard Light plugs actually be a little more comfortable to my ear. Custom plugs. Anybody got custom plugs? I'm curious. Yeah, a few people here. Okay. There used to be, I don't know, there's got to be somebody here in the New Orleans area who is sort of approved. There's a company called Sensophonics that's sort of the home of custom calibrated plugs. And they have actually trained audiologists all over the country. There's got to be at least one or two in town that know how to do the impressions for custom plugs. What's great about custom plugs is, well, they're custom. They feel really good. They're very comfortable. You can wear them forever. And they come with these little buttons. I've got an example up here if you want. I have the show and tell stuff with this big a group. I can't necessarily hand stuff around. But there are 3 different attenuations of buttons that you can buy for these plugs, 9, 15, and 25 dB. And depending on what you do, you could use a different filter. I carry all 3. I actually mix with 9 dB plugs. When I don't mix front of house anymore, But when I used to mix front of house, I would I would do the sound check, no plugs, I get the show started, and once things are stable, I pop my earplugs in. Well, why would I put my earplugs in if it's not safe? Well, here's the thing. You mix the best you can, right? You get the best mix possible. Then somebody comes up and goes, wow, it's kind of loud. I go, yeah. Well, can't you turn it down? No, not really. Well, the guitar's got a little bit loud. I said, the guitar's not even in the mix. So if I turn it down, all you're going to hear is guitar, right? So that's the classic scenario that front of house engineers face. But here's the other issue. I went to some legacy concerts with my son. My son is 24. We went to see the Stones. We went to see Ringo. We went to see Clapton. We missed Dylan by a week. Anyway, the point is, we went and with the Stones and Clapton. I go out there. We're sitting in the stadium, and the 4K is cutting my head off. And it's like, gosh, this is so harsh. What's going on? I'm thinking, oh, the poor front of house engineer has just lost his hearing. And then I thought about temporary threshold shift. If you're working 5 nights a week, you never recover, and you're mixing through that dip. So what do? You EQ against it. What I call continuous temporary threshold shift. So to protect your hearing constantly as a front of house engineer ensures that you're not shifting and you're going to be mixing much, much better because you're protecting yourself, right? So these are really important things to think about, especially as audio engineers, and certainly musicians, because if you start trying to play through that notch, you're going to be adjusting the timbre of your instrument improperly. There's even an active ear plug now. Now these are a few $100, but it's pretty interesting. We actually now have plugs that you just wear all the time, and when the volume is safe, they are what we call unity gain. They just pass right through with no change, and there's actually a little compressor circuit so that as things get loud, you get upwards of 15 dB of 6 dB of, wait a minute, sorry, 9 dB of attenuation. And then when things get really loud, they shut down and you have a full bore earplug. So it's like an automatic earplug. So the point is, a lot of interesting developments are coming along in this industry to provide new options in terms as far as giving yourself good protection. And these are very musical. This is a very high dynamic range, wide response microphone, a high dynamic range, wide response amplifier, and the compressor circuit built in. In-ear monitors. Who's not familiar with in-ear monitors? Okay, we all know about in-ear monitors. I've got examples of in-ear monitors here. The beauty of them is properly run, right? Again, it's a matter of the musician and the audio engineer working together. You're isolating yourself from, the player, are isolated from the stage volume, and you can get a potentially safe mix of exactly what you need, right? And I think we all see this. They're becoming the norm, especially on television. It's a TV audio engineer's dream because nobody's going to complain about the monitors not being right because everybody's got a personal mix on in-ear monitors. Dave Matthews is one of the poster children of in-ear monitors. He's been using them for over 10 years. By the way, one of the most dangerous things that a person using in-ear monitors can do is pull one out because they want to talk to somebody and never put it back in. Because that's like, you may as well have no in-ear monitors, no monitors at all. Because what's going to happen is, now they're going to turn this one up because this ear is exposed to the room. And now he's got to fight the exposure of the room to this ear, compensating in this ear. So both ears are getting hit. You need to be careful about this. As an engineer, you got to provide them with an audience mix, or at least counsel them on get it back in. Put that plug back in when you perform. There are generic in-ear monitors. Shure and Sennheiser are probably the best manufacturers, my feeling, of generic in-ear monitors. And there are a number of companies now producing custom molded in-ear monitors utilizing a very interesting speaker technology called a balanced armature driver, which I don't have time to talk to you about, but it's a really amazing technology that was born in the hearing aid industry. A guy named Hugh Knowles in Chicago invented it. It's a speaker in a can. And the beauty of it is you can mold plastic around it. So the balanced armature driver is key to the performance of modern in-ear monitors. There is something called the 3D in-ear. I'm kind of running out of time, but it's a really interesting innovation. You see the musicians pulling it out to here. What the 3D monitor does is actually includes a pair of microphones in the earpiece, and they can actually blend real-time sound of the space around them with the monitor mix. There are lots of interesting things being done with them, but it's a marvelous innovation, and it really has saved a lot of musicians from the hassle of having to pull them out. The final question is, what do you do? How do you know if it's too loud or not? I mean, I'm sitting there with an in-ear monitor and say, is it loud? Well, no, it's not too loud. Are you sure? Well, no, not really. There is a product now called the dB Check, which runs in line with the in-ear monitors. Now, what it is it's calibrated to the sensitivity of the monitor, but you're getting a real-time readout of how loud your monitors are, and actually, but you can see this N and O, that's for NIOSH and OSHA. So at 92 dB, you're safe for about 96 minutes on the NIOSH scale, 364 minutes on the OSHA scale. The beauty here is now you got a speedometer, right? We need speedometers to know how fast we're driving, right? You need some kind of metering system with in-ear monitors to know that you're actually operating at a safe level. And this really closes the loop because, again, just using in-ear monitors is not a hearing protection device, right? Proper operation, well monitored, well controlled, and a desire to take care of yourself are all part of making in-ear monitors safe. So what does this mean? What this means is a cultural shift in us and our clients and the public, because the fact of the matter is they just don't know to care. It's that cultural ignorance I was talking about before. You know, once upon a time, this is from a Life magazine in the late 30s. I mean, amazing. Doctors hawking cigarettes, right? I mean, they used to, the health benefits of cigarettes, they used to try to tell us about that kind of stuff. All right, and then in the mid-60s, the Surgeon General said, okay, enough of this. Cigarette manufacturers, you must print a warning label on the sides of on the side of every pack of cigarettes. Okay, that was the mid-60s. It took 40 years to get to the point that we have a smoke-free environments in most everywhere we go. 40 years. That's a cultural shift. The problem is we're fighting the same thing right now. Loud is cool, loud is fun, loud is hip, and we think it's just fine. But we have to do the same thing. It's a matter of starting to do this incrementally. First by us, by the professionals, because we can be role models to the public. When we get bands and musicians convinced that it's for your own good that you learn to moderate your volume, then the level of concerts will actually drop, and people will go to concerts that are actually, wow, this really sounds good, this is really nice, and then go to another concert and goes, wow, this really hurts, you know? And this is how we can potentially start a change. The other thing is, as a concert promoter, you should be offering earplugs. You should be. I think it's the responsible thing to do. People should realize that they should have that option available to them. When the Saints won the Super Bowl, and I don't watch the Super Bowl, I watch the ads, right? So I was actually watching the ads, and there's Drew Brees doing his I'm going to Disney World, holds up his son, and his son has hearing protection. I'm a Drew Brees fan, right? Like, you know, it's like, how cool is this? And that he, you know, did he really think that he was doing something? No, he's taking care of his kid, which is awesome. The thing is, hearing protection does not change your enjoyment of the scenario. This is my son. This is my son, Micah. He's into Psytran, these all-night raves. And so he goes to, he was going to Anna, he was going to University of Michigan. I live in Chicago. He one day has a road trip with a bunch of friends. He comes to the city, and they're going to see some show at Martyrs or somewhere. And they come rolling in the next morning at 6 o'clock. And I go, how was it? It was great. And he goes, was it loud? He goes, yeah. And I didn't say anything at that point because, you know, I wasn't going to proselytize to my son. But later that week, I sent him an email. I said, Micah, if you promise to wear them, I'll buy you a pair. Well, how much do they cost? About $150, $175 a pair. But consider what you're taking care of. He said, okay, oh, cool, all right. So the next time he was in town, I made an appointment with Mike Santucci at Sensophonics. He comes in, gets his hearing tested. His hearing is actually pretty good. And gets molded for plugs, and he's going to pick out the color of his earplugs. I'm thinking he's going to pick flesh color or clear. No, black and purple. Well, he's clearly not concerned about the fact that he's going to be wearing earplugs. And a few weeks later, after he got his plugs, he went to a rave in Toronto. And I called him the following week. I said, how was it? It was great. Did you wear your plugs? He goes, yeah. As a matter of fact, you know, unsolicited. He says, you know, about halfway through the show, I took my plugs out to see how loud it was, and I couldn't get them back in fast enough. So he recalibrated. He recalibrated to the sound of his earplugs and had just as good a time. I got this picture because his buddies posted this on Facebook, and I said, Micah, can I use you? Can you be my poster child? And so, yeah, sure, no problem. So the point is, as I say, good level attention and good level reduction with no reduction of enjoyment. You recalibrate the plugs. You get used to them. They become part of what you do. It's like wearing sunglasses when you go outside. So the bottom line to all this is informed decision making. This is something my wife wrote to me after I had talked to her about, playing through the pain and talking about Michael Jordan and all these sports stars and stuff. And she wrote this to me, which I really loved. Sometimes the love of the game, sometimes the love of what we do blocks the pain. Because we just do what we do because we don't have the information, we don't like the information, or we just choose to ignore the information. It's funny the choices that we make in life. It's a matter of informed decision making and making a choice and knowing that something is hazardous so that you can begin to do something about it. I think that's the most important thing we can do right now. Just realize there's something we need to address, begin thinking about it, and incrementally, you'll be saving your hearing that would otherwise get lost because of overexposure. Take care of what you have, minimize your loss, and there are lots of different ways to do it. If you have any more information, if you need any more information, feel free to write to me. You can see my email address on the booklet. Thank you very much.